Welcome to Let's Talk Global Business, the show in which we look at the economic and business trends connecting the world. I'm Sara Murray, Managing Director International, a conference board, the member-led global think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Today, we're looking back over 2024 with a particular focus on political changes and what they've meant for European business. And it's been quite a record-breaking year for elections, with more than half of the world's population passing through the polls. My guests for today, Isabelle Mateos y Lago, Group Chief Economist at BNP Paribas, and Maria Demertzis, Chief Economist for Europe at the Conference Board. So, Maria, Isabelle, to better frame our conversation today, I'd like to start by asking you both two questions. Of all the elections that have taken place this year, which has surprised you the most, and which do you think will have the most lasting impact on business? Isabelle, would you like to take it first?
Sure. Well, there's plenty of good choices, but I think I would go with France, if nothing else, because this is one election that wasn't really supposed to happen. It wasn't in the calendar. It happened only because President Macron, shortly after the European elections, in fact, decided to dissolve the National Assembly, and that triggered snap elections that really were not due to happen for a couple of years. And they returned a parliament where there is no majority. There are only negative majorities. And that has ushered in a phase of, one might say, political instability, which is going to take a bit of time to get sorted out. So I expect we'll be coming back to this, but let me leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Maria?
Yeah, if I may follow Isabelle's line of thinking in terms of surprises, I would also argue that maybe two things. Well, the fall of the German government, actually, again, in line of was an election that wasn't meant to happen, and of course it will happen next year. But in terms of surprises, I was also surprised by that, even if, in retrospect, you can always justify why it might have happened. I think this is an added election that was absolutely not necessary, if you ask me. And perhaps the other electoral outcome that it's across the board and certainly in Europe is the rise, the great wins for much more extreme right parties, which I think is worth mentioning. And I think we'll come back to that also as the conversation goes on.
Indeed. Let's do a quick fire review of key European elections in 2024. Please give me your 2-sentence takeaway on the impact for business. Let's start in January with Finland's presidential election. Any reaction?
Yeah, there was a presidential election. Remember, Finland has got a system of president and prime minister, and the president is in charge of foreign policy. And in this election, we have a very well-known politician, actually very well-known in Brussels and in Finland, a very seasoned politician, Alexander Stubb, that is now elected as president in Finland. And he is somebody who is very well, versed into what Russia means for the country. And I think that when the war in Ukraine started, he was very much active from an academic perspective. He was an academic at the time, commenting on what it all means and showing deep knowledge about the issue, which no doubt helped in the fact that he was nominated and elected in this position. But all this to show that it is for Finland indeed the Russian invasion of Ukraine is of existential importance, and the election of Alexander Stubb in this position is there to justify that.
So let's move to June, which was one of the first year's big ones, with the European parliamentary elections taking place alongside the Belgian parliamentary elections and the Icelandic presidential election. First reactions on the outcome of the European election for the economy, Isabelle?
Well, I mean, as the previous time, there were a lot of predictions of apocalyptic takeover of the parliament by extremist anti-European or at least Eurosceptic forces, and the reality is that hasn't happened. And Parliament maybe shifted a little bit to the right, but frankly isn't hugely different from the previous one. And indeed, the president of the commission remains the same, and the commission that is starting its work this week has, again, maybe on balance, a slightly more right-wing, less green balance of power than previously. But I would say we're talking about an evolution, not a revolution. And so, if as far as business is concerned, I think that's a good thing, because it promises some measure of stability, as well as the promise, or at least the potential, of changes in areas where business perhaps was less satisfied. In particular, what I have in mind here is the rebalancing of priorities between, green transition being the overarching priority, with now moving to much more focus on competitiveness and growth, and talking about green industrial policy rather than just green transition. And that better balance, I think, is probably something to be welcomed by European businesses.
Indeed. Maria?
Yeah, I mean, I agree entirely with what Isabelle described. I think it's absolutely right. It's really quite important to understand, to see economics actually moving in this direction. I mean, if you're trained as a classical economist, I'm sure what Isabelle says, it will be important here. You will never have accepted the concepts of protectionisms or the concept of industrial policy. And we know that business leaders don't like that. Business leaders like open markets. And yet this is the order of the day. We're moving more in the direction of helping critical industries, and indeed protecting industries in the form of tariffs and other measures.
Yeah, I'm not sure anybody still happily describes themselves as a protectionist or endorsing a protectionist agenda, but I think de facto, yeah, you're right, Maria. We're seeing a greater willingness to embrace measures that are de facto protectionist, but still in the name of some greater objectives, such as economic sovereignty or economic security. Or pushing back against unfair practices. So that's very true.
So again, then let's move further along in the summer. The French and the British leaders, holding the SNAP polls in July. Do you think business leaders were happy with the outcomes, Isabelle?
So I think we need to make a big distinction here between the two sides of the channel. I think in the UK, the election had to happen before the end of the year. I think probably, if you'd asked the population or business leaders, they would have expected it to happen in the fall, rather than in the summer. But my sense is everybody knew that the Tory government, or the Tory Timon government, was coming to an end, and I don't think that anybody was particularly displeased to get the opportunity of a clarification sooner rather than later, with the caveat that because it happened at a time when the government was very unpopular, the result was a very large majority for the Labour Party, which one can speculate maybe would have been less so if the election had been held later. But in a way, that is water under the bridge. The UK now has a very clear, very stable Labour majority, and the Labour government has a very ambitious economic strategy to really invest in public infrastructure, invest in public services, while at the same time doing everything it can to support growth. I think the business community in general is fully on board with that general idea. Then, of course, there's the minor issue of, okay, what measures do you put under this? And here I think it's fair to say that some of the first steps that have been announced by this Labour government, particularly in the budget, and that there has been more criticism from the budget community. But I think at the end of the day, this is a government that is 100% determined to pursue a growth agenda in a responsible, sustainable manner, and and it's a government that has stability for it, and now has a 5-year time span to implement its plan. So I think that's actually extremely positive compared to the situation on the other side of the channel. We're really facing a period of protracted instability in France. For business, it's a situation that creates a huge amount of uncertainty. and we're not seeing, you know, a resolution anytime soon. So that's really a very different situation to the UK.
Yeah, just to add to that, so because we are looking at the numbers for growth and inflation, of course, and the one thing that is quite striking is the spreads, right? The French spreads are now at the level today. They're at the level of where they were in 2012, 2013, different times indeed. I mean, still at 0.6, 0.7. It's not that they're very, very, very high. They're not very volatile.
No. The spread peaked last week at 88 basis points.
88, 0.8. Okay, right.
Yeah, and the yield matched the yield on the 10-year matched the yield on the Greek debt. You'll be happy to know. I don't know if this is something that's in the headlines in Greece, but it certainly has been in the headlines in France. And I wouldn't be surprised if it went higher.
Just to add to this, you know, at the time when Macron dissolved the parliament back in after the European elections, so it was a big gamble for him, right? And it felt very much at the time that he won that gamble. He took the gamble and at least he didn't lose it, whether he won it. But now, of course, this whole thing is unraveling, and all that happened is that he just postponed the difficulties, right? And you know,
I don't know. I think most people in France would say that he did very much lose it. I mean, his own party or the coalition of parties that support him saw their number of MPs shrink by 2/3. And, you know, prior to the dissolution, there was enough, you know, the group supporting him was close enough to a majority that it could function as a minority government, whereas now we're seeing it's almost impossible because the prime minister, whoever it is, it's no fault of, you know, the current one, is completely hostage to very hostile groups on both sides. And if he moves 1 inch to satisfy the far right, then he loses critical support that he needs on the center left. So it's just very, very unstable situation.
Just spending a bit more time, you know, you spoke earlier about the collapse of the German government. Again, not expected, obviously in hindsight, not really surprising, but any other thoughts? Because, you know, we've talked about France, we've also got Germany, you know, thoughts on what this means, because again, it's still a wait, isn't it, until the elections?
So, I mean, on Germany, I, for one, think that it's a positive development that the election has been brought forward effectively from September to February, because what was happening was we had a completely dysfunctional coalition in Germany, which was effectively paralyzed because of the extent of the disagreements between its different components. And the base case scenario for, you know, business or Germany watchers, everybody was, well, we're going to go absolutely nowhere for a year. And that was a really unfortunate situation at a time when the German industry is, you know, doing very poorly. And because it's a big chunk of the economy is stagnating. You know, Germany hasn't had any growth since 2021. So this is very clearly a country, an economy that needs government action. On top of that, we've got the election of Donald Trump, who the last time around had particularly hostile sentiments towards the German export machinery and the very large current account, or rather the very large trade deficit that the US has with Germany. So and Germany is particularly vulnerable to the tariff agenda that Trump has campaigned on. So the reality is Germany was and still is in urgent need of a functional government. And now it's going to get it, you know, significantly earlier than was planned. So I think that's actually really good news for for Germany, but also for the whole of Europe.
There is, and I'm saying this because we've seen it in other countries, there will be a greater increase of a greater relevance of the far right in Germany, and that of course is destabilizing by itself. And then, you know, there are no guarantees that the whatever the new outcome is will actually be more functional. I think this is the issue. Of course, if a government is not functioning, it was from the beginning a very balanced, very difficult to balance, rather, I should say, a coalition. It proved right, it didn't function, and now we're going into elections again with an outcome that is going to be a lot more to the right. And it's not just about the social issues, it's also about the economics of it. It will be a government that is a lot more conservative when it comes to fiscal spending. And if it's a country that requires more spending in this respect, it will get a government that will be a lot less inclined to follow that path. So I worry that the outcome in Germany is not going to really provide much progress.
Obviously, I agree with you. We can't predict what's gonna come out of the elections, and one can't rule out that again, forming a coalition will be difficult. However, I've been struck by the speed of evolution of the debate on the debt brake. This rule that has really tightly constrained public spending in Germany, because it's a constitutional debt rule that says the structural deficit cannot exceed 0.35% of GDP every year unless some kind of exceptional circumstance applies. And Germany is one of the countries in Europe that has the lowest debt to GDP ratio. So it really doesn't need that kind of straitjacket right now. And there is a wide consensus that Germany's infrastructures need a lot of attention, that Germany needs to spend more on its defense, that there are huge needs linked to the energy transition. But effectively, Germany was prevented by that debt brake rule from doing anything. And now the leader of the CDU, who, if the polls are right, is likely to be the next chancellor, has said that he's open-minded about finding ways either to change this rule or to go around it. And I think that's extremely positive. And almost irrespective of the outcome of the elections, we're going to see Germany being able to increase public investment here.
So maybe it's cautious optimism when it comes to Germany.
Well, yeah, well, let's go with that. I think we need it in any case. There's so much less optimism elsewhere that I think it's important. Isabelle is absolutely right. The debates in Germany are shifting in this respect, but at the moment it's just parlance. We need the actions. We need the policies.
So now to November, the US presidential elections. Obviously, it wasn't European, but we have to include it because of the impact on Europe. What's your 2-sentence summary on the impact for European business, Isabelle?
So, I'm an optimist at heart. So I'm gonna say the summary is it's a big wake-up call that European policymakers really badly needed. And I think, without this election of Donald Trump, which isn't just Donald Trump, it's Donald Trump with control of Senate and the House. So Donald Trump with really full authority to implement whatever agenda he pleases. Without this outcome, I fear the Draghi report would have had the same fate as the Letta report and many previous reports before them. That is to end up in a drawer with very little action. Whereas now, policymakers in Europe realize they absolutely have to do something. And of course, it's going to be difficult because even though there's a very wide consensus on the diagnostic put on the table by Mario Draghi, positions are still pretty far apart on some of the recommendations. But I think, to me, it's very clear that the election of Donald Trump is going to accelerate a lot of these decisions that were 100% needed, and is going to energize the Commission, the Council, and the national capitals to really roll up their sleeves and do a lot more to remain competitive in the face of the US.
I mean, it's quite surprising again how surprised we are. I mean, I think that's quite interesting. Back in the 2026, a very single policy that Trump applied, most of the people in Europe were surprised, even though he had announced actually every single policy he did, he had actually announced them. And yet again, I think there is a sense of disbelief in some ways that there is a second Trump administration, a very convincing Trump administration, because obviously the electoral outcome was very, very clear. In terms of what it means for Europe, I mean, I think the very first thing, because there is many things we can talk about, but the very first thing that would need to be tackled is what happens with the war in Ukraine. This is the part that, if you like, would require immediate action, and we are going to have a U.S. administration that is a lot less willing to help with this. In fact, we've heard that Trump wants to finish the war on the first day. These types of things. What it actually means in practice is the bit that we need to get straight. And the one bad news that I see here is with France and Germany actually totally taken up by domestic considerations. Will the two countries be engaging at the European level, which is absolutely essential for European decision making? If France and Germany are not engaging, and if France and Germany are not agreeing with each other, very little happens at the European policy level. So at the time when we need to engage on a very serious issue, what are we going to do on defense? France and Germany are less interested, and by that I mean is they have domestic agendas that they need to pursue, and that of course stalls discussions and stalls decisions. What the Commission can do on this is very little, in my view. The Commission can do things on trade, and they can put in a task force on how to implement Draghi. But when it comes to defense, which in my view is not priority number one, there will be less engagement in this respect.
It's interesting you say that because, there are certain countries that are really worried, about defense and security. And, we've seen Denmark and Sweden, tell their citizens to prepare for, World War III. How do you see that emerging?
So I think we're unquestionably in a world that is more dangerous than it was, prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it's probably going to stay that way. And on top of that, the US under Trump, but probably under, frankly, any administration, has made clear and is going to make increasingly clear that it doesn't want to be responsible for the security of, or doesn't want to be solely responsible for the security of its allies. So because of these two relatively new or intensified realities, Europe, and I would include the UK in there, are going to have to spend a lot more for their own defense and security. And, these resources are going to have to come from somewhere. In the 60s and 70s, people were talking about, guns or butter. Well, to some extent, that these choices are going to come back to the fore. And so it's very understandable that governments are beginning to prepare their public opinions for the fact that more money is going to have to be allocated to defense. And in some countries, that will mean higher taxes. In other countries, it will mean less spending towards other priorities. And these are always difficult conversations and difficult trade-offs. So I'm not surprised that governments are beginning to talk to their citizens in ways that pave the way for these kinds of discussions.
So that brings us to the end of the 2024 election summary. My apologies to listeners whose countries we didn't have time to cover there, but I would like to move on to talk a bit about some of the emerging themes. So at the end of that, how would you summarize the political and economic situation in Europe in December 2024? Isabelle?
So I would summarize it with the paradox. And the paradox is that actually, when you think of what we've been through since 2022, we had the biggest inflation surge since the 70s. I mean, several countries in Europe had double-digit inflation. We had a massive monetary tightening, again, unseen since the 80s. And now we've had inflation come back within target, essentially. I mean, in several European countries, including France, it's now well below targets. And there's the ECB is talking of being highly confident it will hit the target sustainably early next year. And this has happened with barely an increase in unemployment. Unemployment is at decades lows in many countries. And growth, varies. Southern Europe generally is doing really well. Industrial Europe is doing less well. But by and large, this disinflation has happened with hardly any cost. So it's it's actually not a bad situation. It's not a great situation, but it's not a bad situation. It's certainly much better than any forecaster expected at the end of 2022 or even the end of 2023. And yet, in Europe, as in pretty much the entirety of these elections that you've talked about in over 70 countries, the incumbents got either kicked out of power or got a big slap in the face. And in a few cases, including France, the government managed to hang on, or the head of state managed to hang on to power, but with much less support in parliament. And so the electorate is deeply, deeply unhappy about the state of the economy, the state of their pocketbooks, I assume, and their wallets. And that is causing a political terrain that is complicated. I'm hopeful, though, that as a bit more time passes, people are going to realize that actually their incomes have more than caught up with inflation. They're going to realize that they're richer, and as long as the employment market holds up, people are going to start spending more. We've seen an incredible rise in savings rates all across Europe. I expect that at last, as we go into 2025, we're going to see the savings rate go down, and this, reacceleration of consumption should be able to drive growth to better outcomes than what we've seen. But of course, there are risks around that scenario. Things could get derailed, including if we go into some kind of trade war with the US, that will not be helpful. But I think the baseline scenario is actually a pretty good one.
Thank you. Maria?
The issue is that there is, and as we move forward, and now I don't want to take so much of a short term, but a little bit more protracted term, because I think this is where we should be looking for solutions. We do have an economy that is not dynamic enough. I think this is something that's the way I would characterize it. And both the letter and the Draghi report effectively come down to this. We have an economy that it's rich. We have ability to react to shocks, but when it comes to sort of what do we do for the future, this is where things become a little bit more problematic. But I want to sort of point to one thing that really worries me, and it is something that is actually pretty shocking. And there's also a graph in the Draghi report that we need to sort of repeat this. We have, and that is the demographic. This is the part that I think, in my view, stands in the middle of everything. The fact that by the end of the century, the EU will have a much less population than the US. Whereas right now, the EU has about 150 million people more. This will be reversed by the end of the century. And, how do you convince investors to invest in an environment which is lacking that, which has that prospect? Okay, it's a slow prospect, but it is a prospect nevertheless, with no appetite to revert that in terms of policies.
Interesting, really, really interesting. I mean, Isabelle, I really liked your comment about, this is a paradox since given what we've been through since 2022 with inflation, monetary tightening, and all of this has happened. We've been able to come back, to inflation or below target and no real worsening of unemployment. So on the one hand, if you think about that, there is something to feel that we can pat ourselves on the back for. It, it's not great, but it's not as bad as it could have been. And I think you're right, Maria. The Draghi report has got a number of very key and practical recommendations. We see that the European Union is able to react. They did with the pandemic, with the war, or with inflation. Will they be able to do it now at this juncture where, growth and competitiveness is really, really important at the same time as the demographic problem that's only going to get larger?
Maybe to rebound on this question of demographics, because it's true, it's a really interesting one. And, there are ways to deal with a shrinking population or adverse demographics, and the countries that have, it's a widespread phenomenon, obviously, across developed markets. China faces that as well. There are countries that have been able to grow above the sort of pre-pandemic trend growth without generating inflation. Countries like the United States or Spain or Portugal, to name just a few. And how have they managed to do that? Well, they've managed to do that by relying on large immigration. there is no shortage of labor at the scale of the planet. But it's interesting that the Draghi report essentially takes as a given that even though Europe is going to lose, I think it's 2 million workers per year for the next few decades, he essentially accepts that as a fact and says, well, in order to counter that, we need to increase productivity. And here's everything Europe needs to do to increase productivity. And at no point does he say, oh, well, by the way, you could also look at immigration. And I can understand why he made that decision, because it's politically complicated, to say the least. But maybe at some point it is something that if the political climate becomes a bit more pacified at some point, this is something that would be worth looking at.
I couldn't agree more with you, Isabelle. It's exactly what needs what we need. Unfortunately, the politics are going exactly the opposite way, and this is that is complicated. But I mean, I cannot agree with you more. And also, if you were to make some move on this front, then the need for productivity growth becomes less pressing, right? That's basically what it is. And it's interesting that the Draghi report opts not to fight that battle, as it opted not to fight the battle of common debt. It's interesting the choices of the things that the Draghi report does not address. It is a sense of his reading of where politics is going, because obviously he wants a report that is influential, but it is very telling that even though he appreciates the diagnosis, he's not fighting for a cure. In that respect, is a little bit disappointing.
We've been looking at the incredible number of European elections this year, plus the obligatory US election and what all of this means for business. But now I want to look forward. So let me ask you both, is the European economy better off going into 2025 after the 2024 Festival of Democracy, or has it taken a knock? What's your outlook, Isabelle?
So I don't know if it's better off, but I do expect that just looking at the numbers, we're going to see a reacceleration in 2025, and that's going to be primarily that. So that's the central scenario. Let's face it, there are serious risks around this, and again, if we go into a trade war, it will be very difficult for the European economy to do better in 2025 than in 2024. But assuming we're all smart enough to avoid getting into that, I really do think the European economy will perform better in 2025, and that's because ECB is going to be able to keep easing its policy, and they've promised that they were going to be pragmatic and that if they see more headwinds than expected, they might even go below neutral territory. We're going to see consumption pick up again, as I was saying, as households benefit from disinflation and lower rates. I expect that the fiscal adjustment that needs to happen is going to be very gradual and quite possibly less than the Commission would like to see. And so we're not going to get much headwind there. In the case of Germany, we might even see some additional stimulus. There's the prospect of a ceasefire in Ukraine, which should help as well. So and China is going to do what it needs to keep its economy on the track. So I think the base case scenario is actually one of a somewhat better 2025, but again, lots of risks around that scenario that Europe doesn't really control. Oh, maybe just one more thing which we haven't touched on in terms of things that Europe can do quickly to both wake up to the arrival of Donald Trump in the White House and also start responding to the Draghi report is deregulation. I've been really struck by the number of policymakers I've come across in recent weeks in Frankfurt or Paris or Brussels saying this Elon Musk idea of having a tsar for deregulation and government efficiency. We badly need this in Europe. And so I don't know if some kind of counterpart to Elon Musk will be appointed, but I think this is one area where the Commission is going to be under intense pressure from governments to deliver quickly and ambitiously. And just to give you an example, a couple of weeks ago at an event in Frankfurt, Jo Kukis, the new German finance minister, really put his glove down to the Commission and say, look, if the Commission is serious about deregulation, why doesn't it put on hold the new wave of CSRD regulations that are due to come on stream, CSRD being the sustainability reporting directive, right? Instead of rolling in this second wave, which is ready to go, put it on hold and let's use the next 2 years to review whether it's actually needed or how much of it is actually needed. I think something very concrete could be done in, one day, and it would send an amazing signal to the corporate world that, this is one area where the Commission and all the policymakers mean business, and I think that would be very positive.
In terms of prospects, I think that there are things to be hopeful about. For first of all, no more elections we'll have the general elections, but I think the fact that we don't have elections, it means that now we can actually think about planning policies, because a year before elections is always uncertainty and always hesitation to advance on policy decision. Now we are there. There's new terms in many parts of the world, including the European Union. And that's good news. We can pursue a 4 or 5 year policy agenda. That's good news, right? I think the one thing that we need to get right is the war in Ukraine. This is the bit that needs to be resolved with the utmost urgency, because if it is resolved satisfactorily and sustainably, everything else will follow. We will find ways of implementing some of the Draghi recommendations or indeed thinking about competitiveness in a real and concrete way, right? So here, I think, the relations with the US are going to be crucial. The European Union, no doubt, has to build up a much more credible defense position for nothing else than just deterrence. And if we got that right and built it up a credible deterrent in the continent, and then if we find ourselves to coordinate a little bit more on how we do that, we have now a new commissioner for defense. How much can we do more together? Then I think that actually gives us the basis for accelerating the peace process. And then we can start thinking about everything else. I totally agree with what Isabelle had said earlier on in your question, Sara, as to whether there's a third world war coming. I think there is a need to prepare the public that we need to spend on defense.
Yeah. And
that, of course, requires some sort of communication strategy. And I think that's part of this, rather than spreading a fear that there is third world war coming. I think there is much more of a need to spend on defense that needs to be justified and accepted. And that's what I think is going on, rather than preparing for war. And I think that's an important thing, because we don't want to be seen also as being warmongers. I think European Union and the continent does not want war. Nobody wants war. And the only way to do that is to prepare one. That's the paradox in that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. As we wrap up this discussion, let me just ask you one final question. What do you think the key takeaways from this conversation are for business leaders, Isabelle?
I think number one, stay optimistic and don't despair. There's a lot of negativity in the headlines and sort of doomsday scenarios, whether it be, about actual wars, whether it be about, trade wars, have been some dire impact, catastrophist headlines in newspapers about, budget crisis in France or whatnot. I think one should, keep some perspective. As I said, the global economy is actually in reasonably okay shape. And there are incredible opportunities around the transformations that are beginning to happen, whether it be around AI, rollout, build up of infrastructure, adoption, dissemination, whether it be about the energy transition, which the US is going to stop being a leader about, it's a real opportunity for European corporates, whether it be around the changing shape of globalization. For sure, this is going to be this question of, nearshoring, friendshoring, whatever. We're going to have to see what comes out of the Trump White House. But there is an entire world out there who remains keen on on globalization, and that's an opportunity for businesses to tap in. So for sure there are risks, for sure there is near-term uncertainty, but I think for corporates who are thinking about the future of their businesses for the next 5-10 years, the global macro is actually in good shape, and there are huge opportunities around, and you want to be part, I would think, of these transformational opportunities at this time without being too put off by the sort of near-term noise and uncertainty that is still present.
Thank you, Isabelle. Maria?
I think I will share actually Isabelle's optimism. I think that's a very good thing to sort of add, in particularly as you said, into an environment that is actually quite negative in sometimes. Perhaps the two most interesting things in my view is that there are things that we can do. It's not that we don't have the ability to do that. We have the means and we have the ability to do them. So it's just a matter of sitting down and doing them. Like we said, the simplification of regulation is something that somebody can sit behind a desk and actually think about a way of doing that. It's not that you need means that we don't have to do that thing. I think that's an important thing, and particularly for investors and the business leaders, I think it's an important message here. We can do stuff, and it's just a matter of coming together and doing that. But perhaps the most optimistic thing that I would like to point out, and we must never forget that, and by comparison to other parts of the world, democracy in the EU is still very, very strong. Very strong institutions. We have electoral outcomes that are volatile and perhaps not as good as we would like them to be. But democracy has held very, very strong in the European Union, and that's good. It's something that is, in the long term, very sustainable. And only through that can the economy and the system rejuvenate. And with that, I remain very optimistic about the ability of the EU to come out of difficulties, because it has the means and it has the structures to do that.
Excellent. Well, what a wonderful note to end, ladies, that stay optimistic, don't despair, keep perspective. The global economy is in okay shape, and let's focus on the opportunities, because there's a lot of opportunities around there, whether it's AI, energy transition, the changing shape of globalization. There's still a lot of countries that remain open. So, I think it's important, like you said, to remain focused on those opportunities, not get drowned out by all of the negativity, and remember the things that we can control. That brings us to the end of this episode of Let's Talk Global Business. Thank you, Isabelle and Maria, for sharing your insights with us. I think we could have gone on for a lot longer, but we'll be back in 2025 with a focus on new topics. You can find more content on the recent elections and listen to the entire catalogue of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at theconferenceboard-org.org. Let's Talk Global Business is written by Marie-Jeanne Merillet, produced by Margaret Murphy, and edited by Derek Servais and Mark Coracon. Thank you for listening, and Maria and Isabelle, thank you for a wonderful conversation.